The fog over the Hürtgen Forest in late 1944 was not just a weather phenomenon. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of gray that seemed to swallow men whole. In this place, known to history as the Death Factory, thousands of soldiers marched into the woods and never returned. But among the countless tragedies of World War II, one specific mystery stands out: the story of Private Arthur Art Simmons. On a frozen morning in November, Art's entire platoon was wiped out during a frantic ambush near a nameless ridge. Military records later listed every single man as deceased or missing in action, except for one. Art Simmons didn't just survive. He vanished from the grid for 3 days in the heart of enemy territory, only to reappear behind Allied lines without a single scratch on his body, but with a look in his eyes that suggested he had seen something impossible. How does a single man survive a crossfire that leveled a forest? How does one soul endure when metal and fire consume everything else? Today we are going to dive deep into the archives, personal journals, and tactical maps to solve the mystery of the soldier who defied death. If you find these historical investigations fascinating, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a deep dive into the secrets of the battlefield. To understand how Art Simmons survived, we first have to understand the environment he was trapped in. The Hürtgen Forest was a nightmare of tactical errors. The trees were so dense that tanks couldn't move, and the canopy was so thick that it blocked out the sun even at noon. For a young man from rural Ohio like Art, this wasn't just a forest, it was a labyrinth. On November 14th, Art's unit, Company B, was ordered to take Hill 401. They were walking into a trap. The German forces had spent months zeroing in their artillery on every clearing and trail. Think of it like a giant chessboard where the opponent already knows exactly where you are going to step before you even move your foot. Art was a radio operator, which meant he carried a heavy pack and a long antenna, essentially a shoot-me sign for snipers. As the company moved upward through the slush and mud, the silence was broken by the screaming Mimes, the terrifying sound of German Nebelwerfer rockets. Within seconds, the world turned into a whirlwind of shrapnel and splintering wood. In the Hürtgen, the trees were often more dangerous than the bullets. When shells hit the tops of the pines, they showered the men below with thousands of wooden shards, acting like natural bayonets. Art's commanding officer was gone in the first burst. The sergeant was gone in the second. By the time the smoke cleared from the initial barrage, Art found himself face down in a freezing crater surrounded by the silence of the dead. He was alone, or so he thought. This is where the mystery begins. According to the official after-action reports filed weeks later, there were no survivors from that specific patrol. Yet 3 days later, Art walked into a field hospital 10 miles away. To solve this, we have to look at Art's own diary, which was recovered by his family years after the war. In those pages, Art describes a shadow protector. He writes about hearing a voice that told him when to move and when to stay still. Now, as investigators of history, we have to ask, was this a psychological coping mechanism, or was there a tactical reality to his survival? Let's look at the first 24 hours. Art was behind enemy lines, surrounded by German patrols. He had no food, his radio was smashed, and his M1 Garand was jammed with frozen mud. In this situation, most soldiers would surrender or succumb to hypothermia. But Art did something counterintuitive. Instead of heading back toward the American lines, which were being heavily shelled, he moved deeper into the German sector. Why? Because Art realized a fundamental rule of survival. The safest place to hide is often right, under the enemy's nose. He found a discarded German overcoat and used it to blend into the shadows. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He became a ghost. As we move into the second day of Art's disappearance, the mystery deepens. A German patrol actually discovered the crater where Art was hiding. According to Art's notes, a German soldier looked him directly in the eye. Art was frozen, certain his life was over. But the German soldier, perhaps tired of the slaughter or seeing the sheer exhaustion in Art's face, simply turned away and signaled to his squad that the area was clear. This is a crucial element in our investigation. Survival in war isn't always about being the strongest or the fastest. Sometimes it is about a moment of shared humanity in a landscape of inhumanity. But how did he navigate back? The forest was a disorienting maze. Art explains in his writings that he followed the path of the water. He noticed that the small streams in the area all eventually flowed toward the Call River, which he knew was held by the Americans. This is a perfect example of using logic to solve a life-or-death puzzle. While other lost soldiers panicked and ran in circles, a phenomenon known as veering, where humans naturally walk in loops when they lose visual landmarks. Art used the geography of the land as his compass. He stayed low, moving only during the blue hour, that brief period of twilight when visibility is lowest for both sides. By the third day, Art was suffering from severe trench foot and hallucinations brought on by the biting cold. He described seeing his mother standing in the middle of a clearing, pointing toward a specific ridge. While we can attribute this to the brain's reaction to extreme stress and starvation, it highlights the mental fortitude required to stay alive. To Art, these weren't just dreams. They were instructions. He reached the American perimeter near the town of Schmidt, but the danger wasn't over. Coming back to your own side can be just as deadly as being with the enemy. Sentries are jumpy, and anyone moving in the dark is usually shot first and questioned later. Art didn't yell. He didn't run toward the foxholes. He waited for daylight. He took off the German overcoat, which would have gotten him killed instantly, and stood in the open holding his hands up singing the Star-Spangled Banner at the top of his lungs. He knew that even in the chaos of war, his voice was his only ID card. The American soldiers who found him were stunned. They thought they were seeing a ghost. One medic later wrote that Art looked less like a man and more like a statue made of mud and grief. When we analyze this case, we see a combination of three factors that solved the mystery of his survival: tactical intuition, environmental awareness, and a stroke of inexplicable luck. Art Simmons survived because he understood that the forest was an actor in the war, not just a setting. He respected the terrain, he managed his fear, and he recognized the humanity in his enemy. His story serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest chapters of military history, the individual spirit can find a way through the impossible. Reflecting on the life of Art Simmons, we see that he lived a long life after the war, rarely speaking of those 3 days until his final years. He remained a man of quiet dignity, forever changed by the death factory. The mystery of how he survived when everyone else didn't isn't just a matter of logistics. It's a testament to the resilience of the human soul. Thank you for joining us on this investigative journey into the past. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the survival of Private Art Simmons, please hit the like button, share this video with a history buff, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories from the front lines. Your support helps us keep these forgotten histories alive. Until next time, stay curious and keep searching for the truth. But the story of Art Simmons is merely one thread in a much larger, more complex tapestry of survival within the Hürtgen Forest. To truly understand how one man made it out, we must examine the broader context of the death factory and the other shadows that moved within those woods. Because, while Art's survival was a miracle of intuition, thousands of others were locked in a mechanical, grinding struggle that defied logic. If you look at the topographical maps of 1944, the Hürtgen Forest appears as a dense green blotch on the border between Belgium and Germany. To the generals, it was a tactical obstacle. To the men on the ground, it was a living entity. We need to talk about the green hell in a way that goes beyond just trees and mud. We need to talk about the psychological erosion that occurred there, a phenomenon that makes Art's clarity of mind even more remarkable. The psychology of the green hell. In most battles, there is a front line, a clear us versus them. In the Hürtgen, the line was a suggestion. Because of the density of the fir trees, visibility was often limited to less than 20 yards. This created a specific type of combat neurosis that psychiatrists at the time began to call Hürtgen syndrome. It wasn't just shell shock, it was a claustrophobic paranoia. Imagine being Art Simmons or any soldier from the 4th or 28th Infantry Divisions. You are in a hole. You cannot see the sky because the canopy is so thick. You cannot see the enemy because they are dug into pillboxes, concrete bunkers camouflaged with earth and vegetation. The sound of a snapping twig could be a deer, or it could be a German patrol with a flamethrower. The survival rate for replacements in the Hürtgen was abysmal. Some men lasted less than 24 hours. They would arrive at the front at night, be guided to a foxhole, and be killed before they ever saw the sun. This brings us to a critical question. Why did some men, like Art, possess an immune system against the madness of the forest while others succumbed to it instantly? The logistics of agony. To understand the depth of the mystery, we have to look at the sheer failure of Allied logistics during this campaign. The American Army was built for mobility. It was a machine designed for the open plains of France, fueled by gasoline and supported by air power. In the Hürtgen, all of those advantages vanished. The tanks, the Shermans that had liberated Paris, were useless. They got bogged down on the call, trail, a narrow, muddy path that became a graveyard for armored vehicles. When a tank broke down or was hit, it blocked the entire column. There was no room to maneuver. This meant that the infantry, men like Art Simmons, were stripped of their primary support. They were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century tactics. Furthermore, the weather in November 1944 was a relentless enemy. It wasn't just cold, it was a damp, bone-chilling wetness that led to thousands of cases of trench foot. Men's feet would literally rot inside their boots. To survive 3 days alone as Art did, without a way to dry his socks or move his limbs, is a physiological impossibility for most. The fact that he didn't lose his feet to gangrene is a detail often overlooked, but it points to a level of physical discipline that is almost superhuman. He must have massaged his feet in the dark, keeping the circulation moving even as he hid from the patrols. The German perspective. The forest ghosts. To get the full picture, we have to look across the line. The Germans defending the Hürtgen were not the elite SS units seen in the movies. Many were Volksgrenadiers, older men and young boys, the remnants of a shattered army. However, they had the home field advantage. They knew the ridges, the fire breaks, and the hidden streams. They used a terrifying tactic called tree bursts. Instead of aiming artillery at the ground, they fused the shells to explode in the treetops. This showered the American foxholes with a rain of white-hot shrapnel and jagged wooden splinters. In the Hürtgen, the trees themselves became weapons. When Art Simmons was navigating those woods, he wasn't just dodging bullets, he was dodging the forest itself. We have found accounts from German veterans of the 275th Infantry Division who spoke of ghosts in the woods. American soldiers who had been separated from their units and lived like animals in the undergrowth. Most were eventually hunted down. Art's ability to remain a ghost and not a corpse suggests he understood the German patrol patterns better than the Germans did. The mystery of the Wassenack Ridge. One of the most harrowing locations near where Art was lost was the town of Wassenack. It sat on a ridge overlooking the Kahl Valley. The town changed hands multiple times. One day the Americans would hold the church, the next, the Germans would be in the bell tower. There is a documented story of a field hospital set up in a basement in Wassenack, where American and German medics worked side by side, treating the wounded of both sides because the carnage was so overwhelming that the concept of enemy simply ceased to make sense. This is the environment Art was moving through, a landscape where the boundaries of war were blurring into a shared human catastrophe. If Art had stumbled into Wassenack, he might have been saved, or he might have been executed. His decision to stay in the wilds, rather than seeking the relative safety of the ruins, was perhaps his most brilliant tactical move. He chose the uncertainty of nature over the certainty of a combat zone. The aftermath, why history, forgot the Hürtgen. For decades, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest was overshadowed by the Battle of the Bulge. The bulge was a clear victory, a dramatic turnaround. The Hürtgen, by contrast, was a grim, costly stalemate that many generals wanted to forget. It was a meat grinder that didn't need to happen. Historians now argue that the forest could have been bypassed entirely. If the Allied command had focused on the Ruhr dams instead of the woods, thousands of lives, Art's friends and comrades, might have been saved. This adds a layer of tragedy to Art's survival. He survived a battle that didn't even need to be fought. When Art Simmons returned home, he carried the weight of the death factory with him. He saw the prosperity of the 1950s, the moon landing, the turn of the century, but a part of him remained in those damp woods near the Belgian border. Lessons for the modern world. What can we take away from this deep dive into Art's journey? First, that survival is rarely about strength. It is about adaptability. In the 21st century, we often think we can control our environment with technology. Art Simmons reminds us that when the technology fails, when the radio is dead, the map is wet, and the GPS doesn't exist, it is the human spirit and basic situational awareness that determine the outcome. Second, the story of the Hürtgen Forest serves as a warning about the cost of pride. The generals who pushed the men into the woods were unwilling to admit a mistake. They stayed the course at the cost of 33,000 casualties. Art's story is the micro-level victory against a macro-level failure. Final thoughts on the legacy of Private Simmons. As we conclude this expanded look at one of the most harrowing chapters of World War II, we must acknowledge that for every Art Simmons, there were 100 men whose stories ended in the mud. We tell Art's story not to glamorize the war, but to honor the sheer resilience of a human being pushed to the absolute brink. The Hürtgen Forest is quiet now. The trees have regrown, though if you walk through the woods today, you can still find the depressions in the earth where foxholes once were. You can still find rusted pieces of shrapnel embedded in the trunks of older trees. It is a cathedral of memory. Art Simmons didn't just survive the Germans. He survived the cold. He survived the hunger, and most importantly, he survived the despair. He proved that even when you are surrounded by death, you can choose to keep walking toward the light. Thank you once again for staying with us through this deep dive. History is not just a collection of dates. It is the heartbeat of people like Art. We hope this exploration has given you a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices made in the death factory. If you want to see more content where we break down the tactical and psychological elements of historical survival, let us know in the comments. What other forgotten battles should we explore? We read every comment, and your feedback drives this channel. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next investigation. But our exploration doesn't end with the closing of Art's personal file. To truly honor the weight of his experience, we must pivot from the individual to the environment that forged him. To understand the death factory, we have to dissect the machinery of the Hürtgen Forest itself, a place that, even today, remains a masterclass in how terrain can be weaponized to negate every advantage a modern superpower possesses. The geography of a nightmare. When we look at military history, we often talk about force multipliers. Usually this refers to technology, air superiority, or intelligence. In the Hürtgen, the force multiplier was the mud. It wasn't just dirt and water. It was a viscous, freezing slurry that acted as a physical and psychological anchor. For the American GIs, the forest was a claustrophobic maze of Douglas firs so thick that the sun rarely touched the forest floor. This created a perpetual twilight, a gray zone, where vision was limited to 20 or 30 yards. Imagine being Art Simmons knowing that at any second, a sniper or a machine gun nest could be 10 feet away, hidden by a single fallen log. The Germans, under the command of General Erich Brandenberger, understood this terrain with a terrifying intimacy. They didn't just hide in the woods, they integrated into them. They built K positions, interlocking fields of fire that turned every ravine into a kill zone. They used the tree burst tactic with lethal efficiency. Normally, artillery is designed to hit the ground and spray shrapnel outward. In the Hürtgen, the Germans timed their fuses to explode in the canopy. When a shell hits a tree 50 feet above your head, it doesn't just send metal raining down. It turns the tree itself into a weapon. Thousands of jagged wooden splinters, some the size of baseball bats, would spear downward into the foxholes. This is why Art's survival is so statistically improbable. You couldn't just duck. The sky itself was falling. The logistics of suffering. Let's talk about something the history books often gloss over: the sheer physical toll of existing in that environment. We mentioned Art's wet map, but let's look at the reality of trench foot. This wasn't just a minor ailment. In the Hürtgen, the 4th Infantry Division alone suffered thousands of non-combat casualties due to the cold and damp. If you can't change your socks for 2 weeks, and Art often couldn't, your feet literally begin to die while still attached to your body. The skin turns blue, then black. The pain is described as having red-hot needles driven into the bone. Yet, men like Art stayed on the line because there was no one to replace them. The replacement system was broken. Green recruits were being sent into the green hell with only a few hours of orientation, only to be killed before they even learned the names of their squad leaders. The psychological breakdown. The Hürtgen syndrome. Psychiatrists who studied the veterans of this campaign noted a specific type of trauma that differed from the desert or the open fields of France. In the Hürtgen, the stress was constant. There was no rear area. Even the aid stations were under constant shelling. This led to what some called the 1,000-yard stare, becoming the standard expression for the 28th and 4th Divisions. Art Simmons survived because he maintained a level of active detachment. He focused on the immediate task, the next 10 steps, the next clip of ammunition, the next sip of water. Those who looked too far ahead, who thought about the end of the war or their families back home, often found the weight of the forest too heavy to bear. Tactical comparisons. Why was it so hard? To put the Hürtgen in perspective, we have to compare it to the Battle of the Bulge, which followed shortly after. While the Bulge was larger in scale and more famous, the Hürtgen was more concentrated in its misery. In the Bulge, there was room to maneuver, to use tanks, to see the enemy. In the Hürtgen, it was a medieval war fought with 20th century weapons. The American High Command, specifically General Courtney Hodges, has been heavily criticized by modern historians for this campaign. The objective was the Roer River dams. The logic was that if the Germans blew the dams, they could flood the valley and stall the Allied advance. However, the decision to push through the densest part of the forest instead of bypassing it is now seen as one of the greatest tactical blunders of the Western Front. Art Simmons was a pawn in a game played by men who were looking at maps in heated chateaus, men who didn't realize that the roads on their maps were actually unpassable logging trails choked with mines and debris. The silent enemy. The S-mine. We cannot discuss Art's survival without mentioning the shrapnel mine, better known as the Bouncing Betty. This was the psychological king of the forest. These mines were buried just beneath the pine needles. When stepped on, a small charge would pop the mine 3 feet into the air before it exploded, spraying steel balls at waist height. For a soldier like Art, every step was a gamble with his manhood and his life. The forest was seeded with these. Engineers trying to clear paths were picked off by snipers. It was a cycle of violence that felt designed by a sadist. Art's ability to navigate this minefield, both literal and figurative, is why his story remains a cornerstone of survival lore. The legacy of the forgotten battle. Why don't we talk about the Hürtgen Forest as much as D-Day or Iwo Jima? Perhaps it's because there was no glory there. There were no iconic photos of flags being raised, only photos of exhausted men huddled in frozen mud, looking more like ghosts than soldiers. But for the families of the 33,000 who fell there, it is the only battle that matters. Art Simmons became a voice for those who couldn't speak. In his later years, he didn't talk about the heroics. He talked about the cold. He talked about the sound of the wind through the pines, which he said sounded like the breathing of a giant. Lessons for the modern era. What does the death factory teach us today? It teaches us about the limits of technology. We live in an era of drones and satellite imagery, but the Hürtgen reminds us that there are still places on this earth, jungles, mountains, dense urban centers, where the individual soldier's grit is the only thing that counts. It also teaches us about the necessity of dissent in leadership. Had the officers under Hodges been more vocal about the futility of the frontal assaults, thousands of lives might have been saved. Art Simmons survived the enemy, but he also survived the incompetence of his own high command. The human cost, a deep dive into the aftermath. When the survivors of the Hürtgen finally emerged from the trees in early 1945, they weren't the same men who had entered. They were old young men. Art Simmons returned to a world that wanted to move on, to a country that was celebrating victory. But the forest never truly leaves a man. The nightmares, the sensitivity to cold, the sudden start at the sound of a snapping branch, these are the hidden casualties of war. By studying Art's tactical movements and his mental fortitude, we aren't just looking at a soldier. We are looking at the resilience of the human nervous system. Final technical analysis, the weaponry of the woods. To wrap up this technical deep dive, let's look at the equipment. The M1 Garand, while a superior rifle, was prone to jamming in the Hürtgen mud. Soldiers often had to use found German weapons like the MP40 because they were more resilient to the grit. The American uniforms were also woefully inadequate. The M1943 field jacket was a step up, but it wasn't waterproof. Art Simmons likely spent weeks in a state of mild hypothermia. This isn't just a detail, it's a physiological miracle. To maintain the presence of mind to fight while your core temperature is dropping is a feat of sheer willpower. Closing the file. As we look back at the map of the Hürtgen Forest, we see a small patch of land that swallowed divisions. We see the names of towns like Schmidt and Wassenack, places that became graveyards for the 28th Bloody Bucket Division. And in the middle of it all, we see the ghost of Private Art Simmons moving through the trees, checking his wet map, and refusing to become another statistic in the death factory. His story is a testament to the fact that while generals plan wars, it is the grunts who survive them. It is the individual who, when stripped of everything, warmth, food, light, and hope, finds that there is still something left inside. We hope this deep dive into the tactical and environmental horrors of the Hürtgen Forest has provided a necessary context to the survival of Art Simmons. It wasn't just luck. It was a symphony of small, correct decisions made under the most pressure imaginable. Keep these lessons in mind. Whether you are a student of history, a survival enthusiast, or someone interested in the human condition, the Hürtgen Forest offers a grim but vital education. This concludes our expanded investigation into the death factory. Thank you for your time, your respect for the fallen, and your dedication to uncovering the truth behind the headlines of history. We will see you on the next battlefield. Stay sharp. But the story doesn't truly end with the closing of a file or a salute to the fallen. To understand the full scope of the Hürtgen Forest, we must look beyond the tactical maps and the rusted Garands. We must look at the psychological residue, the moral injury that lingered long after the last artillery shell fell silent in February 1945. The psychology of the green hell. If the physical environment was a death factory, the psychological environment was a meat grinder for the human soul. Veterans of the Hürtgen often spoke of a specific type of dread that differed from the terror of Normandy or the frozen desperation of the Bulge. In the Hürtgen, the enemy was invisible, but the environment was omnipresent. Psychologists who studied the aftermath of the battle noted a high rate of what was then called combat fatigue, or shell shock. Today we recognize it as a complex form of PTSD, exacerbated by the claustrophobia of the woods. Imagine being unable to see more than 20 yards in any direction for weeks on end. Imagine the constant sound of snapping branches. Was it the wind, or a German sniper adjusting his position? For Art Simmons and his comrades, the psychological toll was cumulative. Every tree burst wasn't just a physical threat, it was a betrayal by nature itself. When the very things that are supposed to provide cover, the massive oaks and pines become the source of lethal shrapnel. The mind begins to fracture. There is no safe harbor. This led to a phenomenon where soldiers would refuse to seek cover near trees, preferring the open, muddy foxholes despite the exposure. It was a rational response to an irrational situation. The logistics of despair. To truly appreciate the physiological miracle of survival in this sector, we have to talk about the breakdown of the American logistical machine. The U.S. Army was built on the concept of mobility and overwhelming supply, but the Hürtgen was a static nightmare. The mud was so thick that jeep axles would snap. M4 Sherman tanks, the backbone of American armored doctrine, became iron coffins stuck in the narrow fire breaks. When a tank bogged down, it blocked the only path for supply trucks. This meant that for days at a time, men like Simmons weren't getting hot C rations or dry socks. They were eating cold K rations, essentially crackers, and canned meat, which provided nowhere near the caloric intake needed to maintain body heat in sub-freezing temperatures. Consider the socks problem. In the Hürtgen, trench foot was as much of an enemy as the Wehrmacht. When your feet are constantly submerged in freezing slush, the capillaries shut down, the skin dies, and gangrene sets in. The only cure was dry socks and massage. But when the supply lines were cut, soldiers went weeks without a change. Art Simmons's survival wasn't just about dodging bullets. It was about the discipline of taking off his boots in a freezing foxhole to rub his feet, even when every fiber of his being wanted to stay curled in a ball for warmth. It was the discipline of the mundane that kept men alive. The German perspective. The defensive masterclass. To understand why the Americans struggled so much, we have to look at the other side of the hill. The German defense of the Hürtgen, led by General Hans Schmidt, was a masterclass in utilizing terrain as a force multiplier. The Germans had spent years surveying this forest. They knew every ridge, every stream, and every clearing. They built the Siegfried Line, West Wall, fortifications, directly into the landscape. These weren't just bunkers. They were reinforced concrete pillboxes camouflaged to look like innocent hills or even forest cottages. They used interlocking fields of fire. This meant that if an American platoon attacked Pillbox A, they were simultaneously being fired upon by Pillbox B and C, which were hidden in their flanks. The Germans also mastered the pre-registered mortar strike. They knew exactly which clearings the Americans would use for assembly points. They didn't need to see the Americans. They just needed to hear the rustle of movement and call in a coordinate they had practiced for months. For the German soldier, often a mix of hardened Eastern Front veterans and Volkssturm, last reserve teenagers and old men, the Hürtgen was a final stand. They were fighting on German soil now. The desperation of the defender is a powerful thing, and it turned every meter of the forest into a costly transaction in blood. The bloody bucket and the price of hubris. The 28th Infantry Division, known by their red keystone patch, earned the nickname the Bloody Bucket during this campaign. Their experience in the battle for the town of Schmidt is perhaps the most harrowing example of the entire campaign. The division was ordered to take the town, which sat on a high ridge. To get there, they had to descend into the deep gorge of the Kahl River and then climb back up the other side. The Kahl Trail was a narrow, treacherous path that was barely wide enough for a jeep, let alone a tank. As the 28th moved through the gorge, the Germans simply waited. Once the Americans were deep in the valley, the Germans unleashed a hellstorm of artillery. The Americans were trapped in a bowl of fire. Tanks that tried to support the infantry slid off the narrow trail and rolled into the ravine. Medics couldn't get the wounded out. The 28th Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force in a matter of days. When we talk about Art Simmons, we are talking about a survivor of a systemic failure. The High Command, safe in their chateaus miles behind the lines, refused to believe the reports coming from the front. They saw progress on a map, while the men on the ground saw a death factory. This disconnect between leadership and reality is one of The most tragic aspects of the Hürtgen Forest. The environmental legacy, a forest that remembers even today. If you walk through the Hürtgen Forest near the Belgian-German border, the scars are visible. This isn't just a metaphorical statement. The topography of the forest is still pockmarked with the depressions of thousands of foxholes. You can find the ruins of the Siegfried Line pillboxes, many of them blown up by engineers after the war, their jagged concrete teeth still protruding from the moss. But there is a more sinister legacy: the iron harvest. Every year, local authorities and hobbyists still find unexploded ordnance, UXO, mortar shells, S-mines, the infamous bouncing Bettys, and crates of ammunition are still buried just inches beneath the pine needles. The forest is literally still lethal. More somberly, the forest still gives up its dead. Every few years, the remains of a soldier, sometimes American, sometimes German, are discovered. Often, they are found exactly where they fell, with their helmets and boots still intact. These missing in action are finally given names through DNA testing and buried with honors. It serves as a reminder that for some families, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest didn't end in 1945. It is only ending now. The tactical evolution, lessons learned in blood. The disaster of the Hürtgen changed how the U.S. Army approached forest warfare. It was a brutal lesson in the limitations of technology. In the open fields of France, American air power, the P-47 Thunderbolts, and superior mobility could win the day. In the Hürtgen, the canopy was so thick that pilots couldn't see targets, and friendly fire incidents were tragically common. The Army learned that in dense terrain, the squad is the most important unit of command. Large-scale maneuvers are impossible. Victory or survival depends on the initiative of the individual sergeant or private. This is why the story of Art Simmons is so vital. He represents the decentralized nature of the fight. When the radios failed and the officers were killed, it fell to the grunts to decide whether to push forward or hold the line. The doctrine of combined arms, tanks, infantry, and artillery working together, had to be reinvented for the woods. Tanks became mobile bunkers rather than breakthrough weapons. Artillery became a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. These lessons would later be applied in the mountains of Korea and the jungles of Vietnam, though the cost of learning them in the Hürtgen was unacceptably high. Art Simmons, The Micro-History of a Global Conflict. We often look at World War II through the lens of great men, Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, but history is truly made at the micro level. Art Simmons' experience is a micro-history. When he was huddling in a wet hole, he wasn't thinking about the liberation of Europe or the fall of the Third Reich. He was thinking about the next 10 minutes. He was thinking about how to keep his matches dry. He was thinking about the sound of a German screaming Mimi, Nebelwerfer rocket battery, and calculating if the trajectory was headed for his sector. This hyper-focus is what allows a human being to survive the unsurvivable. By narrowing the world down to a few square yards, the overwhelming horror of the war becomes manageable. Simmons survived because he mastered his immediate environment, even as the larger environment tried to consume him. The ethical question: was it necessary? Historians still debate whether the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest needed to happen at all. The objective was to capture the dams on the Roer River to prevent the Germans from flooding the valley below. However, the U.S. command failed to realize that as long as the Germans held the dams, they could release the water at any time. By attacking into the forest rather than bypassing it or seizing the dams earlier, the Americans played right into the Germans' hands. Many military analysts argue that the forest could have been contained with a smaller force, while the main Allied thrust went around it. This adds a layer of tragedy to the survival of men like Simmons. They weren't just fighting a difficult battle. They were fighting a battle that many believe was a strategic blunder. To survive a necessary hardship is one thing. To survive a pointless one requires a different kind of mental fortitude. It requires a refusal to be wasted. The silence of the veterans. For decades after the war, the Hürtgen Forest was overshadowed by the Battle of the Bulge. which began just as the Hürtgen was winding down. The bulge was a clear victory, a dramatic turning point with a heroic narrative. The Hürtgen was a muddy, indecisive slog that felt like a defeat even as the Americans eventually pushed through. Because of this, many veterans of the Death Factory didn't talk about it. They returned to their lives in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, or New York, and they kept the silence of the woods within them. Art Simmons, like so many others, likely didn't view himself as a hero. He viewed himself as someone who did a job that nobody should ever have to do. But their silence doesn't mean the story isn't there. It is written in the pension records, the medical files for rheumatism, often a cover for the long-term effects of trench foot, and the way they looked at a line of trees on a gray November afternoon. Conclusion: the enduring echoes of the Death Factory. As we conclude this expanded investigation, we must realize that the Hürtgen Forest is more than a geographic location or a chapter in a history book. It is a symbol of the ultimate test of human endurance. We have examined the tree bursts that turned timber into shrapnel. We have looked at the bloody bucket and the tactical failures of the High Command. We have explored the physiological nightmare of hypothermia and the psychological weight of the green hell. Through it all, the figure of Art Simmons remains, our North Star. He is the representative of the 33,000 American casualties in that forest. He is the reminder that even in the most efficient death factory ever devised, the human spirit is a remarkably difficult thing to break. The lessons of the Hürtgen are grim. They tell us that war is often a series of mistakes paid for by the young. They tell us that nature is indifferent to our ideologies. But they also tell us that even in the darkest, wettest, most terrifying woods, there is a capacity for resilience that borders on the miraculous. When you look at a map of Europe today, the Hürtgen is a beautiful, peaceful place. Hikers walk the trails where the 28th Division fell. Birds sing in the trees that once rained wooden shards. But if you listen closely, and if you know where to look, the echoes of 1944 are still there. They echo in the stories we tell, the records we uncover, and the respect we pay to those who walked into the Death Factory and, against all odds, walked back out. Art Simmons didn't just survive a battle. He survived an era. He survived a breakdown of civilization that manifested as a dark forest in Germany. And by remembering his story, in all its technical, tactical, and emotional complexity, we ensure that the Death Factory never truly gets the last word. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never forget the cost of the ground we stand on. This concludes our deep dive into the Hürtgen Forest. Until the next time we step into the shadows of history. End of file.